Feeling at home in one culture at the beginning of the 21st century is difficult. Imagine being at home in two. And that just scratches the surface for Antanas Sileika. Author of several books, he's considered something of a cultural rock star in Lithuania. But he's actually born and raised right here in Canada, the son of Lithuanian refugees, and until recently, he was the director of the Humber School for Writers. He tells his tale of cultural agility and much more in his most recent book, The Barefoot Bingo Caller, a memoir, and it brings him to our studio tonight. Welcome.
Hi, nice to be here.
Well, the title of your book is quite interesting. Obviously, I know what it means,
right.
But for our viewers, give us an idea of what it refers to.
It's a lifelong problem. It runs through the book to a certain extent. There's endlessly trying to fit in and finding a problem. So I was going to a booze can, after hours club, back in the days when the bars closed at 1. And you had to walk behind a warehouse, and there'd be in the darkness a guy smoking a cigarette, and he'd look at you. And when he looked at me, I got brought there by some friends, much cooler friends. He looked at me and said, "Shoes, man."
You had the wrong shoes on.
I had hush puppies. Now, nothing is not hipster like hush puppies. As a matter of fact, I think I look like a narc. So we came out, and my friend said to me, "Look, if we want to get into a club, you got to lose the shoes. No time to buy new ones, no time to get new ones." It was summer, I took them off, and I walked around barefoot.
And no one thought that was kind of out of the ordinary?
Well, you know, keep in mind you're an after-hours club, right? So people look at you as you walk in barefoot, and there were some questions about this. And I had a crude trick that I used to pull in those days because my feet were tough from the summertime. I could butt a cigarette with my bare feet. So people would look at you and just have this smoke, like say, "Why are my shoes off? Look at this." You throw the cigarette down, you butt it with your foot. Anything else you want to know?
So you were very cool.
I was trying. I could carry it off for minutes at a time.
But you also, in your spare time, you were a bingo caller.
Well, a bingo caller, what a great gig that was. You know, I call the bingo caller kind of, I don't know what, the low-life Tony Bennett, the Las Vegas, more like Atlantic City, because I was always in a hall with, oh my God, sometimes 1,500 people, of whom 1,450 were smoking, me too, and you just roll every 8 or 10 numbers, you roll off a number under the B6, right? Because it's a long night. And it was very exciting. I was a student for part of that time, and the money was great. I got paid in cash. So I had one of my bingo patrons won that night and took me out for a night of wonderment.
A night you won't forget.
Right, yeah. Exactly.
Well, let's talk about your life and this idea of belonging in Canada. Your name is Antanas, but that's not the name you grew up with growing up in Western Ontario.
Oh, no.
What name did you grow up with?
Well, we had indoor names and outdoor names. So indoors we were called one thing, my brothers and I, but outside they were Andy and Joe, my older brothers, and I was Tony. And I was Tony for the longest time until about the first year of university. I had this, I'm smiling, I had this kind of an insight. And the insight was, I was christened Antanas, and I will never answer to Tony again. And I was terrible. Friends say, "Hey, Tony." There is no Tony.
There's only Antanas.
right. To this day, if I hear a call of that, it's someone I knew in high school.
So did you, like, growing up, was there like a cultural split, the way you were at home and outside of the home?
Huge. At home, we didn't speak English. But I was a big fan. I guess I was an Anglophile. I loved everything British. I loved the big maps. We no longer had the British Empire, but we had the Commonwealth. I thought the Commonwealth belonged to me. I thought I was English. I wanted to be Sherlock Holmes. But I was mistaken in that because I had a pal, Vaughan Kurgan. When I think about it, the name is actually Irish, Kurgan. But I thought he's so English, I'd hang with him. And his grandmother came to visit, and I was introduced to her, and she said, "Pretty boy, pity that he's a foreigner." It's like, so there's a club. You think you're a member, but you can't be a member.
Did you experience any shame growing up being Lithuanian?
Shame. I lived in shame. Are you kidding? We came from Lithuania, along with a lot of other countries like that. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine is kind of true of as well. They no longer existed on the map. So it was terrible. Nobody knew where these places were. They'd say, "Where are you from?" And say, "Lithuania." And say, "What? Lithuania? Is that a religion?" So, and on top of everything, there are always comic moments. So it's a little bit sad, but it's always a little bit funny too. So they had a basketball, I guess a series of teams that played every Sunday afternoon after church. And I used to call it the Vanished Nations League, right? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine. So you're from nowhere. So I desperately wanted to be somewhere, And although I was disappointed not to be British, it wasn't wounding particularly. It's like, I can't win playing this game. How can I win?
But at home, I'm guessing that your parents tried to foster an identity for you.
To say the very least, to foster an identity, it was like a prison of ethnicity. Because I grew up, I'm born in the 50s, but I grew up in the 60s. So it's a time of granny glasses. It's the summer of love. And meanwhile, my mother was a chemist for the feds. She used to analyze street drugs. She knew, she'd talk with cops. She knew what was going out in the streets. So she was watching me look for dilated pupils and so on. Always, so it's very exciting outside in those 60s. I'm a little young for them, but still, I want to be part of it. But I can't because I have to wear a folk dance costume and dance Lithuanian folk dances, which, by the way, you could hold girls a lot. That was good.
But I guess looking back in a way, well, even just reading your book, you kept saying that you wanted to escape. As I'm reading it, for me, it felt idyllic, like you had an idyllic home life, but you wanted to escape it.
Well, there were, idyllic in retrospect, but there were certain things. I grew up in Western Ontario, which was a little town on the edge of Toronto that got swallowed, and it was the land of sports and all
hockey.
Hockey, and I'm the only kid. I played for the school team for 4 years. I scored 1 goal. And it was disallowed for some reason. I think I'm the only one who's not a goalie who got a career shutout, I mean, so I was useless at it. So first, I'm trying to become British. Then I'm in this idyllic suburb where I'm prevented from joining the mainstream.
From being Canadian.
From being Canadian, right? And I'm being held back in all various kinds of ways. I need to break out in some fashion. I need to find a place for me.
You went to Catholic school.
I sure did.
And you have retained fond memories of your Catholic education.
Do I ever have fond memories?
Which is something other people might not say.
No, of course not.
What did you like about it?
I love, well, in retrospect, I love the ceremonies. I recall things like carrying some religious ceremony, and we'd be carrying I don't know what to call it, even a litter of some kind, with a big statue of the Virgin Mary's, and the 4 boys carrying it around the halls on their shoulders. We had to go to Mass every first Friday, but a friend of mine and I rolled dice on the pews between us. We started gambling during Mass.
In church?
You bet. Well, there's a nice flat spot there, right? And the nuns couldn't see us. And there are all kinds of funny things like going down to a stadium where they had a Mass reading of the Rosary. It's a Sunday afternoon. We've already been to church. It's 150 degrees centigrade outside, and we're all saying the Rosary. What was that for? So I disliked it. I felt constrained by that too in my youth. But now, where I am now, I think it was great.
Why?
I love it.
Why?
For me, first of all, it was primarily boredom when you're young. In the old days, there was a high Mass and a low Mass. And even as a kid, before I could read, I'd walk in and say, small candles good, big candles bad, right? Big candles meant high Mass meant a long Mass. It was fantastically boring to me. But now, at the age that I've achieved, such as it is, I occasionally go to funerals, not many of them like this anymore, Catholic funerals, where they'll say the Rosary. And the Rosary is really a form of meditation. So the thing that bored me to tears in my youth has now become something that provokes a reflective moment. And then furthermore, on the issue of religion, complicated subject. But I looked upon religion as being NDP, in other words, sweet, good, redistributive wealth for everybody. But at this point, I look upon religion as mysterious, like string theory or something you can't quite figure out. Who says religion's got to be nice? Maybe it's not. Well,
you write, everybody needs to escape the box that we're born into. What were you escaping from? Well,
a few things. So it's first the small town, the ethnic background that I had, the sports inabilities. I needed somehow to exist. And this invisibility that I lived under, that I'd mentioned, made me feel as if I didn't exist. I needed somehow to prove my existence. And in early days of writing, it was by seeing my name in print. Suddenly I'm there.
So is that where you felt like you would belong?
Well, that I am, more than belong, be. right? I have to be somehow. Then all those things that I escaped from in my youth suddenly become different with age. So the sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning is a sweet sound to me. The smell of cut grass is a sweet sound. Going to Mass is no problem. I kind of like it now, right? Sports, not so much.
When did you figure out that writing was your refuge?
Writing was an outgrowth of a natural storytelling tendency we have in our family. Everybody told stories. My mother, my father. When I was a kid, we used to drive to the cottage. My father was cheap, so no radio in the car. We'd say, "What happened to you during the war?" And he'd tell these stories of bombs and the horse pulling their wagon, dying, and my mother diving into a ditch as they were being strafed. It's like, wow, you know, such boring people, such good stories, because parents are always boring, right? My mother had a good sense of humor as well. So all of us are storytellers, and eventually it was just moving those stories onto the page.
I don't want to jump too ahead of our conversation, but later on you find out, I found it interesting that throughout the novel, you are talking about, you're looking for stories to tell, you want to tell stories, and then later on you find out that within your own family, there are all these stories.
Well, right, there's like skeletons in the closet, right? So there are all kinds of things one discovers, especially keep in mind, there's a wonderful book by Timothy Snyder called Bloodlands, and Bloodlands are the lands that were occupied by both the Nazis and the Soviets. So that's a very dramatic, a very tragic place. It's where most of the Holocaust happened. So as I go back, because I do my research in that area, primarily in Lithuania, I uncover more and more stories, more and more things that need to be opened up and looked at, but there are skeletons. So I discover, for example, in a magazine article, my deceased father's prison photo. It's like, what? Prison photo? Well, he was agitating against the government, and he had been caught. I mean, it was not a democratic government. So he was with the wrong party, and he's thrown in jail. On the flip side of that, another one of my uncles was hiding a few boys, Jewish boys, in his house. And there's actually a terrible story. My father had a terrible sense of humor. And during the war, he knocked on my uncle's house where he was hiding a Jewish boy. And my uncle called out, "Who's at the door?" And my father, big joker, says, "Gestapo." Not funny, right? Not funny at all. So there are various things that are buried there. I'm not sure I finished that archaeology yet.
At what point did you decide, or did you realize that you could make a living from writing novels?
Well, I still can't make a living, frankly, from writing novels, right? It's like jazz music, right? Don't quit your day job. So I started out, I was a teacher. I started out as an English as a second language teacher with brilliant lines to my class, such as, "It is a book, everyone repeat. It is a pencil, everyone repeat." So I went from there and I evolved into a literature teacher and then a creative writing teacher, and I ran a creative writing program. So it took me a while to find my place, but I was always writing magazine stories, short stories, and then eventually books too.
At some point, you go to Paris.
Ah, yes.
Hoping for what?
Well, the girl. Paris is always about a girl. So what happened was this. I had no intention of going to Paris. I had the intention of going to Australia. So upon graduating from university, I needed to get some money, and I got a job in a parking lot shack, to the mortification of my father, who said to his friends, "My son works in the admin at the University of Toronto. Meanwhile, I'm in the parking shack."
Well, you're at the university.
I was working, kind of. And a friend's sister used to walk by in front of the shack, and I fell for her, and I fell hard. And she was going to Paris to study art. So one thing led to another, and I followed her. And you know, almost 40 years later, I still am. And
you got married while you were there?
We got to the amusement of our friends, right? Because it's slightly boho, you know, in that crowd in their 20s in Paris. So among our, not so much the Americans who were there, but among the Parisian friends, we said, "We're getting married." And they said, "Getting married? Is she pregnant?" I said, "Well, no, she's not pregnant." Then why are you? Because it seemed outrageous that anyone, sort of a bourgeois thing to do, right?
Why did you get married?
Why not?
Why not? Well,
no. Let me be a bit more specific. Snega, my wife Snega, who's the girl that I chased, very pretty, very attractive to a lot of people, by God, I've got to get a hold of her before somebody else does. And marriage seemed a bit more secure. You can still get out of that, but you know, it's a bit more secure.
So you got a bit of pushback from your friends, but was there a conflict between thinking of yourself as a writer and being a married man?
You know, strangely, was no conflict for me. Paris was where I learned how to write. We were at Shakespeare and Company. We ran a literary journal there upstairs, and we were reading manuscripts. So there was an apprenticeship that happened, a literary apprenticeship in a bookstore, learning to read, learning to talk about literature. And I had kind of a dramatic moment there. There was a journalist at the time, Boyd Neal, wanted to do an article about Canadian writers in Paris, 50 years after Morley Callahan had been there, and he couldn't find any. So he found me. I'd published one story. I thought, oh my God, one story. Yeah, I made it. The journalists want to talk to me already. And then he said to me, who are your favorite Canadian writers? I'd studied English lit, not Canadian lit. I barely knew what to say beyond Margaret Atwood. And I was so embarrassed that when we returned to Canada from Paris, there used to be a bookstore called Longhouse Books on Yonge Street, Canadian books only. I bought 50 Canadian literary journals. We had $750. I spent a third of that on literary journals and spent about, I don't know, 6, 8 weeks reading them all because I felt I still needed to learn. I had to learn not only how to write, but I learned how to write and be in Canada.
You mentioned you were a teacher,
yeah.
And I was laughing out loud while I read that passage about students like clipping their toenails in your class. So that became a rule, like no clipping your toenails in class. What other rules did you have in your classroom?
I was, you know, as things became more and more permissive, the students had a sense that unless something is explicitly forbidden, it is permitted. So, and they were actually permitted to eat in class by this point. But these salads that go out, and they take off the crunch, 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 crunch of saran wrap. Some of the ones squeezed the pack of dressing, shot it across the room. So I forbade eating in my class unless you're hypoglycemic or worse, right? In my class, you were permitted to drink coffee, spill it on someone's notes, you pay. You can eat a candy, but you can't eat a lollipop because the stick going up and down your mouth is so distracting to me. So I kept on adding rules, but only rules for things that had actually happened. So I never expected to have a rule, no toenail clipping in my class. But one day I'm standing there at the board and look, and these funny little colored arc is flying across. I go, what the? And I look down, and a young woman in the front row is clipping her colored, painted toenails. So I added to the list, no clipping of toenails either.
What did you like about teaching?
It was a lot of fun. The kids, they were kids, and as you get progressively older, so the more distant you come from that age group, they tended to be between 18, 21, 22, 23. First of all, they're demanding. I was a grammar teacher. I had to teach about, you know, clauses and commas. As a matter of fact, I said I made a living on knowing two things, commas and apostrophes. Right? That's it. People are confused about them always. But the kids would always push back. So you got to, so how am I going to spend 3 hours with 35 20-year-olds talking about commas and apostrophes? I'd tell a story. I'd ask them to tell me a story. We had to muse one another in one way or another, and it made me stretch. I liked it. I liked it a lot.
Many of your stories in your memoir, in one way or another, involve food, drink, and cigarettes.
Completely.
Not in that order. Is it your Eastern European background that's responsible for your love of food, drink?
You know, I've been wondering.
Cigarettes.
Well, cigarettes, not so, no more. I still love cigarettes, by the way. I walk behind people who are smoking on the street. I love the smell of secondhand smoke. I would smoke if I could, but alas, after 35 years of cigarette smoking, that's all your body can take, probably less than that. I've been wondering about this. Food has always played a big role. My mother would call me up and say, have you ever done a French icing? I said, do you mean the boiled icing, the emulsion? She says, I'm a chemist. I know what an emulsion is. Don't explain to me. Have you ever made one? And I'd say, no. She said, come over, we'll make a couple of icings. So we're a foodie kind of family. But I think like a lot of that generation, my parents' generation, which had suffered lack of food during the war, food played a big role for them. My mother also worked all day, so all 3 sons were expected to cook dinner every day. And we got into it. I'm into it even now. I mean, I read the La Russe Gastronomique totally from beginning to end. because it's very amusing. It's a bit of being a bon vivant. There's so many good things in life, and food and drink within all within reason are parts of that wonderful life.
You're right. Something about the Rocky Canadian Shield brought out the Canadian in me. It wasn't Toronto with its diversity. It wasn't the literary scene, but it was the Canadian Shield.
Yeah.
How come?
Well, I'd never been up in Northern Ontario, of course, is Canadian Shield, very rocky. And I didn't see it till I was about 15 or 16 at summer camp. And I was astonished. It's like the first time you see mountains if you haven't grown up with them. I was amazed by the massiveness of them. And then my wife's relatives all had cottages on the Canadian Shield. And I had envisioned myself maybe as a Parisian boulevardier or something, you know. I said to my wife, holidays will be a hotel lobby, newspapers, ashtrays, bars.
Sounds perfect.
Right, and she said, the perfect holiday will be hiking, canoeing, tents, and insects. But she won, as she so often did, rightly so, I guess.
And you grew to love it.
Grew is not the word for it. There's a certain amount of peace that comes down in nature if you have that thing in you. And I certainly do, where suddenly you're out paddling and everything calms down, everything settles, and it's a meditative kind of trance that one goes into up there.
Well, you write that you were not entirely comfortable in the country of my birth, which is Canada.
Right.
What was missing?
What was missing? I guess I had my parents' trauma carried over to my generation. So I look upon Canada as a kind of a, I was going to say desert island, but I guess idyllic island. And there are shipwrecks all around the world. All these shipwrecks and all these people get washed ashore. Thank God they're here. It's paradise. It's paradise, but something's been lost. So because my parents fled as refugees, they always insisted that this was, wonderful though it may be, this is not the life we were intended for. But then the children, the grandchildren come, and they're fixed here. In some people, I think I must be one of them, that sense of loss lasts for a very long time. I began to travel to Lithuania because it's a dramatic place. I have access to the history because I have the language. And I found a strong pull there. Again, that Bloodlands territory, so much tragedy and sort of a grotesque kind of humor. I mean, a guy told me a story about how his father was deported to Siberia with the bicycle he was riding. They let him take his bicycle to Siberia. It's very strange and complicated. So there's always been a pull. I was born here. This should be my natural place. And yet there's an uneasiness that makes me move over there too. And of course, my sons have split me, one's here and one's there now.
Well, at some point around the late 80s and 90s, you became involved in helping Lithuania's leaders, hoping for independence to gain hearings in Ottawa. What pushed you to embrace your homeland? It
was funny, you know, there was a pivotal moment for me. This would be in 1988. I was at Wasaga Beach up at the cottage. And a friend said, come here, I want to show you a videotape. And the videotape was of a small demonstration in Lithuania, about 300 people demonstrating against the Soviet occupation of 50 years earlier. That had never been permitted before, that 300 people could actually do something and then be taped doing it, no matter what happened to them later. And I walked out on the street and I realized, I had a premonition, the entire world is now changing. And I looked around me, and you have a sense in life that everything will be the same. You assume it will be the same, but I knew something was happening. So I immediately called up Ann Collins, who was an editor at Saturday Night Magazine. I said, something big is happening in the Soviet Union. I have access through this little crack of Lithuania. I've got to go there. Will you send me to write a story? And she did. She and another editor, George Galt, both sent me off. And I walked in. Suddenly, it was like walking into the French Revolution. There's an electricity in the air. There's this giant repressive structure pressing, and in the inside there's something building as well that's going to explode. And you have the sense of justice and injustice, and I threw myself into that fight, not as much as many others. I threw it within my capabilities, functioning primarily as a journalist or as a helper.
Even a translator, though?
Well, a translator. Yes, a translator. I was Brian Mulroney's translator to the Lithuanian president, which had led to a comic moment. Even in the tragedy, even in these, even all this funny thing, or not funny, but dramatic things going on, even then, there's comedy.
What makes you feel Canadian when you are in Lithuania?
The ease of life in Canada is quite something. We forget how good life is here. Pick something up, buy something, sell something, see someone. Over in Lithuania, it's in Europe, but in the poorer part of Europe. Therefore, things cost more, things are harder to do. The average age of a car there is, I think, 12 or 13 years. People have, so it's tougher there. So here it's very, very easy. But it's not just that. I have to admit that whether it be the Canadian Shield, whether it be a canoe, all these iconic Canadian things appeal to me. Also Canadian news. I can't stand traveling the world without hearing Canadian news. So all those things make me feel super Canadian.
Well, one of your sons was a Canadian soldier in Afghanistan, and he now lives with his wife and your grandson in Lithuania. Is he the ultimate example of bicultural identity?
I wonder what he's an example of. I think it's a third generation that moves to his grandparents' country and then learns and has his wife learn the language and has a child there. So the pull somehow seems to be strong. Canada is such a safe haven, such a wonderful place, and yet there's an attraction outside as well, and therefore there's a tension, a pull that goes on forever and ever. Not for him so much. I think he's pretty certain where he is. You could argue, some have said he's a romantic. He said, my grandparents were driven from this country. If they drive us out, we'll come back.
It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. And like I said before we started taping, Stand By Me, the movie, I see this in a Toronto setting.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for being here, Antanas.
Take care.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.